Hi, good morning, and thank you very much for this opportunity. If the presenter could be, one of the administrators could please share my screen or share the presentation so that I may take people through it. But perhaps while the administrator is sharing the screen, perhaps let me start off by saying that I'm really honored to have this opportunity to be the keynote speaker. As the chair introduced me, I'm currently working with COSATU as the acting executive director, but most of the people in the water sector, both in terms of civil society organizations as well as the departments, and those who've worked with me historically know me to be a fervent water activist. I think from the early 1990s and 2000s, as we moved into the water for sustainable development, and as we moved into gear, there was a fundamental challenge by civil society organizations, labor being a part of that, of course, around privatization, around the attack on the access of water. And we engaged quite vociferously with the Department of Water Affairs. And I think why this particular process in terms of a constitutional dialogue is absolutely imperative is that historically, with various ministers of water affairs and Mike Muller, when he was still the DG, under Ronnie Caswell's, there was a commitment made by the department to recognize the role of civil society organizations and the role for community voice through citizens' participation to be acknowledged. And sadly, despite the fact that we went through several phases of the Masimambani program, which was funded by the EU, which allowed for bottoms-up engagement with civil society organizations, community representatives, labor activists from all parts of the country, really engaging at local levels, with the provincial departments, within their own caucuses, and then coming together at a national level through a dialogue process with the Department of Water Affairs. It's really, really sad that despite all of the efforts, I think significant improvements and engagements that we've had that led to really fundamental policy changes in terms of documents, that despite all of that effort, including the resources and the time that was spent, that we're having to almost start all over again. So again, thank you very, very much for giving me this opportunity. Water is life, sanitation is dignity, and as a water activist more than anything else, and I think within a gender framework, I feel that completely obligated and deeply, it's a deep resolve for me as an individual, as a woman, as a South African, to really be advancing the key issues in relation to water access and actualizing water rights in South Africa. I think in preparation for my presentation, I've got an extensive background and experience in relation to different provinces, different forms of challenges that different communities have had. And I must say, I mean, because we had quite a good representation from the Water Caucus in Limpopo, I didn't particularly focus on that. But noting the fact that we are in this province, I think it would be absolutely important to locate this discussion within the context of the Limpopo province, noting the fact that we are now almost 40 years into our dispensation. We have the most amazing constitution. We have the Freedom Charter. We have the UN Declaration on the Right to Water. And yet the Limpopo province and the people of the province, particularly the poor, the historically disadvantaged communities in the rural areas, struggling and really fighting to have their rights realized in relation to water and sanitation. I'd like to start off by premising the discussion with a report that I came across while preparing for this. The portfolio monitoring group, the parliamentary monitoring group, noting the difficulties around water access in Limpopo and the concerns related to that, undertook research in Limpopo. And they wanted to find out what exactly was the status quo, what was actually happening in the Limpopo province, noting the fact that when you look at the statistics around water services and sanitation services, the Limpopo province came out exceptionally short, and that the issues around people realizing their rights was not being realized. Interestingly, this research and the oversight visit took place just before COVID hit, and I'm sure when we engage in the group work and when communities give their input, if we thought that the situation before COVID-19 was bad, I think COVID-19 would have not only showed us the horrific conditions that people are experiencing with regards to water and sanitation. But it would have also have exacerbated some of these horrific challenges. And I think for the Department of Water Affairs, and particularly for local government who are responsible for water service delivery and for sanitation, the challenges have just gone exceptionally real. And it's something that we have to confront if we are going to realize our rights. So I think the key thing that one of the key things that the committee found was, firstly, so I've got slides to raise some of the, the key issues, but I won't necessarily stick to it, but it's for people's convenience. I'm sorry that it wasn't available before the time, but I'll speak to some of the key issues that are within the various slides. So one of the key things that the committee found was that when you ask the Department of Water Affairs, and usually there's reporting that go to the Portfolio Committee and Parliament, when they started looking at what were some of the key challenges happening within the province and what were these realities, when they took the reports from the department as well as Stats SA data, they found a direct contradiction, or maybe the kind of ways in which the data was represented did not reflect the actual realities and the harsh conditions that people in the Limpopo province were experiencing, both with regards to water and sanitation and access to, or realizing their rights in relation to access to both these services. What was further quite shocking is that in one instance, the committee found that there was a huge investment in bulk infrastructure, and also in investment in reticulation service, in reticulation infrastructure. So it means that the municipality, through the grants it received, actually put in infrastructure, meaning pipelines, in order to distribute water from the dams to the water processing plants and then to households. But despite the infrastructure being built, and despite millions of rands being poured into the infrastructure, when it came to opening the tap, and I think Mike Muller's issue in relation to why is the taps running dry, this would be one of the reasons. The end result of actually opening up the tap from the water treatment plant to allow for water to flow through those pipes so that people could have access did not happen. So you have infrastructure but no water. And when the municipality was actually asked, like, you've made all this investment, you've built the infrastructure, what is the reason that you've actually faltered on your responsibilities to ensure that that people have right to access water? The municipality came back and said, well, in actual fact, we do not have skilled personnel. We do not have engineers. And as a result of not having the necessary skilled personnel and engineers, the people of Limpopo don't have money. Now, this is an indictment. I mean, we've got this. I mean, there was another issue in the report where people were arguing that there's a shortage of skills. Now, if anybody works for the Department of Water Affairs, or if you're in a water sector network, you will see how many civil engineers throughout the country are actually looking for employment. So this notion that there is a lack of skill, there's a lack of engineers, and therefore this is the reason why people like the communities in Limpopo, as well as other parts of our country, do not have access to water, is absolutely a misnomer. It's a lie. There are sufficient engineers. The difficulty, and I think some of the issues that we challenged as civil society organizations, is that through the 2000s going into, particularly at the height of 2010, there was a concerted effort by engineers who initially worked for the departments, sometimes worked within local municipalities, to actually become consultants. Many of the engineers who were within the municipality were had knowledge of public information by virtue of the fact that they were located within the local authority. They then left the municipality and then decided that they would support the municipality through a form of consultancy and then do the same work, right, that they were initially supposed to be doing as an employee of the local municipality. We challenged this as civil society organizations. We've engaged with ministers of water affairs, and I'm saying ministers because it wasn't just one minister. From the time of Ronnie Casserols all the way up to Sanjika, Minister Sanjika, who was the last minister who actually gave us the time of day as a civil society grouping, we dialogued and consistently engaged the fact that you cannot be spending millions of rands on consultants and at the end of the day not providing people with water and sanitation, because and the misuse of money was completely and utterly misplaced. In fact, we even pushed for a resolution, and at some point it was actually passed in Parliament, that there would be no consultants used by the Department of Water Affairs. Sadly, as our constitutional right to water began to wither away, we then saw the introduction of consultants starting to take form again. And again, if you think of how civil society organizations as well as labor, with the onslaught of privatization, sometimes poverty, as we became weaker and as the spaces for constitutional dialogue started to close, the things that we were contesting, like privatization and like the use of consultants, rather than actually dedicating rather than dedicating the money to the people so that you can improve water services and improve access, it did not happen. I think another issue in relation to the report was that there was a large number of grants, again, going towards resource infrastructure, so building of dams. So the Nando Dam was constructed in 1998 all the way through to 2005. But when you look at once the dams were, and then there was the De Hoop Dam, there was the Mooihoek Dam. So all of these were or infrastructure set up to provide people in Limpopo with water. Sadly, the infrastructure was built, the money was paid, the investment was made, but the communities sit without water to date. And this is a serious challenge. And what is a great indictment is that if in 2020, despite the fact that the money was put in for this massive infrastructure to be built, but the regulation and the mechanisms to ensure that the people and the community within the provinces and rural communities in particular were the ones who were going to actualize their rights in relation to water, the fact that this did not happen and hasn't been happening up until 2020 is also a serious indictment. I think what the report also found within the context of Limpopo was that, in many instances, politics plays quite a large role in relation to whether or not things happen. And when the department was engaged and the municipalities were engaged on why is it that water was not being delivered, in many instances they placed the buck at the house of the traditional leaders. They were saying in many instances, because they couldn't find synergy or come to some forms of agreement, it was the traditional leaders in the rural communities that were actually stalling or in some ways becoming obstructive to the process of water being rolled out. Now, 1994-2020, seriously, can it really be possible that through a process of negotiation or dialoguing or engaging from a department's perspective with our traditional leaders, that we cannot realize the right for people in those communities to actually access water? It's something that's mind-boggling, that the department can actually use traditional leaders and politics between the department and the rural authorities as being the reason for why we have such poor service delivery in the province. Another key issue in relation to the local municipality was the issue around cost recovery. So when cost recovery is a process or a system that was introduced in 1997 under GEAR, this means that initially when a municipality used to deliver a service, it saw itself as a public institution. People were seen as citizens as opposed to being users and people from whom you must appropriate money. So the service was seen as a public good as opposed to a commodity. So you don't operate water as a business or sanitation as a business. As we moved into 1997 and under GEAR, there was a push for privatization, in some instances full-blown privatization, in other instances in the form of cost recovery and commodification of our services. And what this meant was that initially, where there was subsidization for water infrastructure or for water services, now the money had to come from the citizens themselves. Now, one can think, particularly if you take, again, the Limpopo province with a large constituency of rural communities, if historically the apartheid state did not put in the necessary infrastructure, it was not subsidized. Now, under the new dispensation, under our so-called democracy, you give the municipality greater responsibilities. You ask them to extend the reticulation services into the rural communities, but then you say, but when you put in the water, noting that it's going to be massive amounts of infrastructure and pipelines, you say, don't forget that if we're going to support you, you must make sure that the money that you're getting back from the communities, who, let us remind ourselves, were never getting water before, they must be able, the money that you get back from them must actually pay for the overall cost of you actually putting that infrastructure in the first place. So from a history of apartheid, this is a double-edged sword. How do the communities who are historically disadvantaged, who are not being given access to water, now have to carry the costs for actually getting water, which is a right enshrined in our constitution? Sadly, despite I mean, if you note the context of cost recovery, of course, the poor communities in the rural areas were never going to be able to pay the rates in accordance to recouping the full costs for the bulk infrastructure and for the maintaining the entire system. And as a result, people did not get access to water. And I think when we think of COVID-19 and we look at this context, can we imagine, you know, every single advert on TV was speaking about washing your hands, using soap, washing your hands, using the, you know, using the toilet. Here you've got communities who historically, prior to COVID, did not have access, and then were hit with COVID-19, and the kinds of challenges around water and sanitation were then exacerbated. I think that, you know, just the concept in terms of what the realities were for this particular community, communities across the province. I think I'm looking quite forward to both the chat inputs as well as the group work sessions to actually hear the voices from the communities in relation to what has actually been their experience and what are some of the key things that we can do as civil society organizations, or for them in particular as communities. How do they use the kind of space? And I think through this dialogue process, this is what the process is trying to do. There's a recognition that there's been in some ways an atrocity against the people in this province. And I don't think it's limited to the Limpopo province, but it's an indictment that in 2020, people do not have access to water and sanitation. And the fact that there's a misrepresentation from government side, from the Department of Water Affairs side versus people's realities is what is actually calling for, I think, very, very strongly, a dialogue between communities, between civil society organizations who represent communities, between the local authorities, and between the different spheres of government to actually start addressing the key challenges that are facing the community. I think what's also important, I think, in relation to the sessions that are coming up, we've got these key themes, and I think all of these themes are particularly important for the community activists who are, and community representatives who are currently attending this meeting. I think if you take Mike Muller's presentation, which is going to come in the group, which is going to be looking at the reason for why water is not coming out of the tap. And while Mike, I think in some instances might be focusing it quite substantively in relation to infrastructure and budgets that go to the municipalities, I think it would be important to hear the voices from the communities in terms of their understanding of what are some of the key challenges that they're experiencing. What kind of efforts have communities been advancing in order to realize their rights in relation to accessing water? And where are the blockages and what can we do as civil society organizations, but I think more specifically as this platform that's being presented by the HSRC and the other colleagues, what can we do to be able to advance, you know, from a platform for dialogue to be able to improve the lives and conditions of people in the Limpopo province. I think with regards to the Water Research Commission presentation, which is going to be looking at when an institution like a local municipality fails in its responsibility to provide water for communities and to provide proper sanitation, what does that mean for civil society? What does that mean for communities? Now, this is not something that's new. During 1994, as we transitioned and local authority jurisdictions were changed, we saw some municipalities instituting a process called BOT, which is Build, Operate, and Transfer. And in this instance, what the municipalities or what the department was arguing was that in a context where we had a shortage of skill or where there wasn't enough capacity within the municipality to provide the services, communities should become actively involved, and maybe there should be a process where communities themselves take responsibility for the provision of water and become actively involved. Now, this is a good principle generally, but what we mustn't forget in terms of our constitution and within the bylaws of our country, the roles and responsibilities for the provision of water reside with a specific authority. So when civil society organizations, as a result of the lack of access to water, not because of anything of their doing, not this lack of access is in and of itself a violation of their constitutional rights. So as much as we would like to create, and I think the Water Research Commission will give a methodology in relation to how communities can actually go about facilitating processes for accessing water, which is a right, I think we should not lose sight of the fact that the responsibility still sits with the Department of local government, and that the Department of Water Affairs, as the regulator, is responsible for ensuring that the rights of people's that people's rights to access water and sanitation is actually something that they must regulate and must ensure. I think in terms of other key questions that one would need to consider as we're looking at a process for a constitutional dialogue for how communities can engage quite effectively with the various authorities, and also the roles and responsibilities that we can take as active citizens. We might want to consider, do we have the networks? If we're wanting to take over the water services supply, or if we're wanting to do it in collaboration with the municipality, does the Limpopo province or any other province in the country, for example, do civil society organizations and communities have the necessary network to consolidate such an initiative? What would it take in terms of human resources, in terms of skills, in terms of commitment from the various partners that we're engaging with within the sector? What would it actually take for us to realize the rights, and for us as communities and civil society organizations to partake in that? Furthermore, I think a point that I raised already is, what does it mean for service delivery in South Africa, and the role for municipalities and communities? Again, it is constitutionally, it is our right to access, we have the right to water. It is the responsibility of a municipality as the implementing authority to ensure that that water is provided. Now, whether they provide it themselves or whether they get another service provider to do it, again, there's a contestation in relation to whether it's public or private. But at the end of the day, the responsibility for municipalities in relation to their roles as dictated to by the law, they should not be left off the hook, despite the fact that communities would become involved in this. We also have to be quite clear that when we're advocating for a shift in order to realize people's rights, that we're not advocating for privatization. We're not advocating for corruption. We're not advocating for job losses, and we're not advocating for outsourcing. Throughout our history in South Africa over the last 20 years, if not more, our water landscape has been exceptionally complex, and we've had various forms of privatization. We've seen corruption, we've seen job losses in relation to outsourcing, as well as when the local authority decides to go with a private company as opposed to actually keeping the services public. So these are key challenges when we start to think about how do we dialogue around accessing rights or actualizing our rights for the communities in Limpopo, that we must be clear that in actualizing those rights, we don't find ourselves actually motivating for conditions that actually work against us. I think in order to address the real problem, we also need to collaborate with each other. There needs to be massive collaboration between the various stakeholders. Water is an absolutely complex landscape. I think we as civil society organizations who've engaged and as activists who've engaged in this process have realized that you cannot win this as civil society organizations. And that's why this particular process in relation to a constitutional dialogue is absolutely imperative, because you need to bring the various stakeholders on board in order to be able to engage quite openly, honestly, and seriously, because that it's going to take, and definitely with absolute commitment and conviction to wanting to achieve and realize the rights of the people in Limpopo, but also in other parts of our country. I think there was also a piece of research that was done by Safara Carling Monanshe, and what she said was, after having looked at the sanitation and water challenges in the province, she indicated that in fact water forums, particularly in relation to local catchments, was a model that she found could work because it was about one based on collaboration. It was with various interests around around water access in the catchment and on allocations was actually being well articulated, and that the manner in which the various representatives within the water forums were able to engage and discuss their issues allowed for a really good model to be taken into a water services space. Just to my last two slides in terms of wanting to conclude, I think what we need to ensure, again, in terms of Mike Muller's presentation, why are the taps running dry? We have a role as civil society organizations, as much as it is that we are experiencing the fact that the taps don't open or that there's no water coming out. We cannot sit back and accept this situation. Our constitution enshrines the right for us to act as civil society organizations. In fact, the Department of Water Affairs at one point, when I think in the early 2000s, I think around about 2007, had developed a program called Citizens' Voice. And it was a program where the department, in conjunction with local government, facilitated a process with communities where they allowed and exchanged information and allowed citizens within the country, within a specific province, within a specific community to articulate their voices, to raise the community challenges and issues. And because there was regulation, and there is regulation for the Department of Water Affairs, as well as for local government, with regards to what their roles and responsibilities are, we too as citizens have rights, but we also have responsibilities. And through a process of social dialogue, it would be imperative for us to actualize our rights as well as our responsibilities by holding our governments, or different spheres of government accountable where they lack the capacity to deliver. We need to raise it. Where they are providing inefficient services, we need to be articulating it, and we need to hold them accountable. I think the current local elections is an absolutely important space. It's our constitutional right to vote for the local authority and the representatives that we think would be able to advance our rights and our interests. But I think in exercising that right, we have to also be responsible, and we have to think very concretely in relation to who and what we're wanting as communities with regards to water and sanitation. I think just in terms of one of the last points in relation to the role of business, I think this is quite a controversial issue when it comes to people's right to access water. And I think particularly for the Limpopo province, we know that the mining companies in many instances, historically, when the local authority was not able to provide water services, water and sanitation was by and large given as a responsibility to the mining sector. Sadly, when the mines closed down and the operations were no longer in existence or were no longer going to operate, the communities who were relying on the water and sanitation services coming from the mining sector were then left without services. In many instances, it also left the municipality with an attitude where they did not have to actually go and extend services to the mining affected communities, because they felt that the mines would be the ones who would be responsible and in some ways reneged on their own responsibility. The communities, I think, in terms of their own location, by virtue of the local municipalities historically not providing services to them, probably felt that, when a private sector partner actually provides you with water services, you actually have an improved conditions in terms of your livelihoods, and therefore did not contest this. The sad part is when the mining sector leaves, it is not their responsibility enshrined by any constitution or any law that they are responsible for the provision of water to citizens. That remains a responsibility of local government, as well as the regulator as the Department of Water Affairs. And therefore, again, when we as civil society organizations engage with the private sector, we must be clear that when the private sector is providing us with a form of service, that there's no obligation, and it does not relinquish the responsibility of a local municipality to ensure and enshrine the rights of the communities. I think what we've also seen is that while the mining companies on one hand provided in certain instances water services to our communities, they were also culpable and responsible for massive forms of pollution in the form of acid mine drainage. And once they've left the area, the high levels of radioactivity, as well as the polluted water that they left behind, was not congruent with the water services that they actually provided. So I think, again, from a constitutional dialogue perspective, from a rights and responsibility perspective, but also responsibly as communities, when we start thinking about engaging in stakeholder dialogues and participating and working out an agenda that realizes our rights in relation to water and sanitation, we have to be really, really clear on what it is that we're articulating. We do not want to be worse off than what we were without water services. I think in conclusion, I'd like to reiterate the point that I started with. Water is a right, sanitation is dignity. And Minister Kado Asmal, when he spoke about the rights of water for all South Africans, I think it is absolutely important to premise that he was not talking about access. There's a fundamental difference between water access and water rights. So I can have a tap in my yard, and I think in Limpopo, the fact that you might have reticulation speaks to the fact that you might have access. It's an access point. But if you don't have water in that tap, you do not have water. So we need to, as civil society organizations, and I think particularly for this province, noting the challenges around water and noting the platform for a constitutional dialogue, demand the right to have water and not leave it at the position of we'd like to access water. The ideal the ideal in terms of Kado Asmal as well was the progressive realization of rights. This means that, you know, in the early 90s, what he was talking about is for communities who had no water, you would move from no water to a communal tap, to a yard tap, and eventually you'd have in-house connections. I'm sure the communities throughout this province would be able to say without a doubt, and I think COVID-19 has also demonstrated throughout the country, that the progressive realization that was articulated in 2000s by Kado Asmal 20 years later in the water sector has not been realized for the majority of South Africans. And this is an absolute indictment. And I think it is important, again, for a platform like the Constitutional Dialogue to really benchmark where we're currently at. I think that the kinds of research that the HSRC used to do historically in terms of benchmarking water and sanitation services for a while might not have happened, and it's something that is of dire need. And I think through this constitutional dialogue process, I'm sure communities in this provinces, but also civil society organizations who've either joined physically or who are on the Zoom, will articulate a need for this to be resurrected and to be put on paper and to put in and to be brought into the limelight, because it is definitely an indictment noting the many years we are into our dispensation. I think what's also important is that, again, from COVID-19 perspective, we've seen how COVID-19 has exposed poor service delivery, particularly in the context of water and sanitation, not just in the Limpopo province, but throughout our country. I want to reiterate that our constitution, as well as the international declaration by the United Nations, says that water that we have the right to water. We should use this as a platform and a vehicle to realize our rights, and we should use this constitutional dialogue as a process to perhaps build on many processes that the communities in Limpopo and civil society organizations in this particular province and throughout the country are having, to be able to advance the kinds of the struggles that we have in accessing, in having water and sanitation for all South Africans. I think the Citizens Voice Project, which was started in 2000, it was a pilot project. It realized really important objectives, but again, perhaps local government being threatened by civil society organizations and communities having voice, which is our constitutional right. In some instances, constitutional dialogues are actually very frightening. And unfortunately, perhaps through that process, with local government not being trained to listen and to hear, and not see this as an indictment or an affront on them as a local authority, I think we need to revisit that. And perhaps, again, through a process of dialogue and perhaps through this platform, this is something that can be explored. We also need to advance, and this is my concluding remark, we need to advance our rights. We need to fight against children drowning in sewage in terms of VIPs. And I think this is something that happened in this province, and it's something that is you know, whenever I talk about or I make reference to this particular example, I still feel a lump in my throat, because it's an absolute indictment that we can have children in rural communities from historically disadvantaged communities dying, in VIPs. It's an absolute indictment. I think furthermore, community activists being killed, like we've seen in relation to not just water protests, but also in the context of coal. So when a community and community activists exert their rights and articulate their rights in relation to what is enshrined within the Constitution, many a times through a process of constitutional dialogue and various constitutional platforms, it becomes painful when rather than being heard, they get killed. I think it is important that we actualize our constitutional rights and have our constitutional rights enshrined and realized. Thank you very much.